At my late husband's memorial dinner, my daughter-in-law raised her glass and mocked me for having a boyfriend at 68. I stood, pulled an envelope from my purse, and said, "At least I found mine while single. Let's raise a glass to my mother-in-law, who just found herself a boyfriend at 68. Cynthia stood at the very head of the mahogany dining table, holding her wine glass high enough that dark red drops spilled onto my crisp, white linen tablecloth. The 30 guests attending my late husband's memorial foundation dinner let out a collective, uncomfortable gasp. My son Sean sat directly beside her, staring blankly down at his plate, like a thoroughly cowed child who was too terrified to speak up. Cynthia smirked brightly, clearly waiting for me to shrink into the floor with overwhelming embarrassment. She genuinely believed that publicly exposing my quiet afternoon coffee dates with David, a sweet retired high school history teacher, would utterly humiliate me in front of my conservative extended family. She desperately wanted everyone in our community to think I was just a lonely, foolish old widow acting completely inappropriately for my age. I did not flinch, nor did I lower my eyes. Instead, I carefully set down my cloth napkin, stood up with steady posture, and smoothed the front of my dark blue dress. At least I found mine. While single, I said, my voice echoing with absolute clarity across the quiet banquet room. Which is significantly more than I can say for you, Cynthia. The entire room went dead silent. Cynthia's arrogant smirk instantly faltered. She slowly lowered her wine glass, her sharp eyes narrowing with sudden caution. "What on earth are you talking about, Nora?" I reached down into my leather handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I had truly hoped it would never have to come to this moment. For 6 whole months, I had remained completely quiet while she treated me like an obsolete, inconvenient nuisance in my own family. But she had gravely mistaken my patience for absolute weakness. "I am talking about Justin, the young contractor you have been secretly paying out of Sean's business account for the past 8 months, I stated plainly. Sean snapped his head up instantly, looking back and forth between us in total shock. Cynthia's face completely drained of color as she gasped for air. To truly understand how we ended up at that chaotic dinner table, you have to look back 3 weeks prior. I live completely alone in the comfortable 2-bedroom suburban home that my late husband Thomas and I built with our own savings 30 years ago. It is certainly not a massive mansion, but it is entirely paid off, filled with precious lifetime memories, and most importantly, it belongs entirely to me. Sean and Cynthia lived just 10 minutes away in a modern subdivision. I loved my son dearly. But over the last 2 years, I came to the painful realization that I had raised a grown man who simply could not stand up to his domineering wife. Cynthia viewed my financial independence as a direct threat. She wanted complete control over the family dynamic, and even more importantly, she wanted to dictate exactly how my husband's modest estate and assets were managed. The underlying tension finally exploded on a humid afternoon when Cynthia showed up at my house unannounced. I was working in the backyard garden when I heard strange noises coming from inside the hallway. I walked through the back door to find her carrying a large cardboard box filled with Thomas's prized leather-bound history books toward the front door. "What exactly are you doing with those, Cynthia?" I asked, wiping soil off my hands with a garden towel. "Oh, hello, Nora," she said, without looking even remotely embarrassed or caught. "I'm taking these over to the local donation center. Sean mentioned that you desperately needed to declutter this place. You're holding on to the past way too much." "Sean never said any such thing," I replied, keeping my tone firm and cold. Put those books back right now. He did say it. Actually, Cynthia lied, glibly, taking another step toward the open front entrance. You're turning into a bitter hoarder, Nora. It's honestly quite sad to watch. When I stepped directly into her path to grab my husband's beloved books back, she aggressively shoved the heavy box straight against my chest, causing me to stumble backward. I barely caught myself on the hallway console table, bruising my shoulder hard against the dark wood. She did not apologize at all. An hour after Cynthia drove away from my house, I called Sean to come over immediately. My left shoulder was throbbing with pain. But what hurt significantly more was the utter lack of respect shown inside my own home. He arrived 40 minutes later, still wearing his work shirt and looking completely stressed out. I guided him into the entryway, showed him the scattered books on the floor, and pointed to the dark red mark already forming on my arm. Sean, your wife, physically pushed me in my own hallway today. I told him, fighting hard, to keep my voice steady and composed. She came into my house without permission and tried to take your father's personal belongings. Sean rubbed the back of his neck nervously, completely refusing to meet my eyes. Mom, please come on. Cynthia already called me and said it was a total accident. She said you aggressively grabbed the heavy box right out of her hands and simply lost your balance. She lied directly to your face, Sean, I said flatly. She stepped into my private residence and tried to steal my property. She was honestly just trying to help you clean up this clutter. Sean snapped back, his voice rising in deep frustration. You're 68 years old, Mom. You live in this big house completely by yourself, surrounding yourself with dead people's old belongings every single day. Cynthia is just trying to help you move forward with your life, and you're acting like she violently attacked you. I stared at my adult son, barely recognizing the boy I had spent decades raising. He was not an inherently evil person. He was simply profoundly weak. He actively preferred to believe his wife's obvious lies because confronting her meant completely blowing up his own comfortable marriage. It was infinitely easier for him to blame his aging mother. I do not need her intrusive help, Sean, I said very softly. And I certainly do not need you to fix my life. But if she ever disrespects me in my home again, there will be serious consequences. Are you actually threatening my wife right now? Sean asked, looking completely incredulous. I am setting a healthy boundary, I replied coldly. One that you should have set years ago. I am not a saint, nor do I claim to be a person who is always right. In the painful days following that terrible argument with my son, I foolishly allowed my bitterness to consume my daily thoughts. I spent hours obsessing over how unfairly I was being treated, which ultimately only made me deeply miserable. I eventually realized that sitting around waiting for Sean to validate my hurt feelings was a completely losing battle. I needed to focus strictly on objective facts, not raw emotions. The opportunity to uncover those facts came quite unexpectedly. I serve as the lead volunteer treasurer for our local historical society, a respected position I have proudly held for over a decade. My good friend David and I were spending a Thursday afternoon organizing old financial records at the community center when Cynthia's business name unexpectedly popped up on a vendor receipt. Cynthia runs a small, independent interior design consultancy firm. She had been officially hired 6 months ago to remodel the community center's administrative office space. As the official treasurer overseeing the budget, I had every legal right to thoroughly audit those financial receipts. While carefully reviewing the detailed vendor file, I noticed something exceptionally strange. An independent subcontractor named Justin was billing Cynthia's design firm $4,000 every single month for vague, specialized consulting. However, the attached work orders did not align with the community center's actual project timeline at all. Later that same week, David and I were having a quiet lunch at a diner located 2 towns over, far away from our immediate neighborhood. As we sat near the large front window, I happened to notice Cynthia's distinct crossover SUV pull into the parking lot of a budget motel directly across the street. A young man wearing dusty work boots met her at the entrance of room 114. It was Justin, the subcontractor from the invoices. David looked across the table at me, noticing my hands had frozen completely over my hot teacup. "Nora, what on earth is wrong? That woman getting into that motel room is my daughter-in-law," I whispered softly, my chest tightening. I did not take creepy photographs like a private detective, nor did I hire an investigator. But as a former professional bookkeeper, I certainly knew how to cross-reference dates and financial bank statements. I sat alone in my quiet living room for 3 whole days with the financial records and the detailed timeline I had carefully put together. I knew I had a profound choice to make regarding my family's future. A large part of me desperately wanted to run directly over to Sean's house, dump the paper trail right onto his lap, and loudly declare, "I told you so." But I knew exactly how that impulsive scenario would play out in reality. Sean was so deeply trapped under Cynthia's emotional influence that he would immediately accuse me of fabricating the financial records or invasively digging through her private business matters out of pure mother-in-law malice. He would fiercely defend her, and I would wind up looking like the bitter, meddling villain. I also had to candidly admit to myself that my own hands were not entirely clean in this situation. I was utilizing my authorized access as treasurer to quietly investigate my daughter-in-law's private life. It was undeniably a gray area, legally and ethically, and it made my stomach churn with discomfort. Was I truly doing this for genuine justice, or was I secretly doing it out of a petty desire for personal revenge? I decided to talk the entire matter over with David while we sat drinking tea in my garden. "If you use this information purely as a weapon to hurt her, Nora, it will completely blow up your entire family," David warned me, gently reaching over to softly hold my hand. "Is that truly what you want for your son? I just want her to stop trying to destroy my personal dignity," I told him honestly. "And I desperately want my son to see the objective truth before she ruins his life financially." "Then do not strike first," David advised me wisely. "Protect your own boundaries, but allow her to make her own bed." I carefully considered his wise words and decided to follow David's advice. I neatly packed the bank statements, receipts, and timeline into a plain manila envelope and stored it safely inside my locked desk drawer. I firmly resolved never to use those documents unless Cynthia pushed me to the absolute edge. I genuinely hoped she wouldn't, but Cynthia was far too arrogant to leave well enough alone. The annual Memorial Foundation dinner was officially held at our town's local country club. It was a formal event specifically created to honor my late husband's legacy of charitable community service. I paid for the entire venue hire and catering out of my own personal savings every single year. I proudly invited David to attend as my personal guest for the evening. We were certainly not trying to hide anything from anyone. We were simply 2 widowed adults enjoying each other's genuine companionship and moving forward with our lives with grace and maturity. However, when we arrived at the venue, Cynthia was already standing near the entrance wearing a flashy, expensive emerald dress. She watched David politely pull out my chair with a visible sneer on her face. Throughout the entire cocktail hour, I repeatedly caught her whispering to Sean's aunts and cousins, pointing directly at David and shaking her head with fake pity. During the second course of the dinner, Cynthia suddenly stood up from her seat and loudly tapped her glass with a silver spoon. "Everyone attention, please," she called out to the room, her voice dripping with dramatic theatricality. Sean quickly tried to tug at her silk sleeve, looking immensely embarrassed by her public display, but she casually brushed his hand away. "We all obviously know why we are gathered here tonight, to honor Thomas's memory," Cynthia announced loudly to the entire banquet room. "But I think we should also take a moment to recognize Nora. It honestly takes an incredible amount of courage for a woman of 68 years old to put herself back out on the dating market. Let's all raise a glass to celebrate Nora and her brand new boyfriend." A few distant relatives let out a nervous chuckle, but most of the people in the room immediately felt the cruel, mocking sting underlying her words. She was not celebrating my happiness. She was openly ridiculing me for dating at my age, deliberately painting me as an unfocused, foolish old woman who had moved on far too quickly from her husband's memory. She looked directly down at me, raising her glass higher, fully expecting me to flush with intense embarrassment and run out of the room crying. Cynthia wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to frame me as a desperate widow, making a fool of herself in front of everyone. That was her absolute, fatal mistake. I stood up very slowly from my chair, feeling the heavy weight of 30 pairs of eyes staring directly at me. I did not feel a sudden surge of blind rage. Instead, I felt a cold, incredibly clear sense of absolute stillness settle over my mind. "At least I found mine while single," I said, my calm voice cutting effortlessly through the silent room. "Which is significantly more than I can say for you, Cynthia." The entire banquet hall went dead silent once again. Cynthia's cruel smile dissolved in an instant. "What on earth are you talking about?" "Nora." I opened my handbag, pulled out the thick manila envelope I had brought along in my purse just in case she pushed me, and laid the documents flat on the table directly in front of Sean. "These are official business bank statements from your joint account, Sean," I said, speaking with complete composure directly to my son. "Cynthia has been writing monthly checks for $4,000 to a young contractor named Justin under the fake guise of specialized consulting. In reality, she has been secretly renting room 114 at the Oak Ridge Motel with him every single Thursday afternoon." Sean looked down at the invoices, his hands trembling violently as he read through the dates and matching signatures. "Cynthia, what on earth is this? She is lying to you," Cynthia shrieked loudly, her voice cracking with pure panic. She stole those private documents. She is just an old, bitter woman desperately trying to ruin our happy marriage because she thoroughly hates me." "I did not steal anything at all," I replied calmly. "The invoices were officially submitted to the Historical Society for audit. As the treasurer, I review them. And as for the motel, David and I saw you walking into that room with your own eyes 3 weeks ago." David nodded quietly beside me, confirming my statement to the room. Cynthia turned frantically toward the guests, desperately seeking allies, but everyone was staring at the paper trail in front of Sean. Sean stood up from his seat, his heavy dining chair scraping loudly against the polished wooden floor. He stared down at the detailed financial invoices and then looked directly at his wife's panicked, pale face. For the absolute first time in 5 long years, the blinding fog in my son's eyes completely cleared away. "Is this where our home renovation budget actually went?" Sean asked Cynthia, his trembling voice barely above a whisper. The savings we were supposed to put toward our future down payment. Sean, please, let's go home and talk about this privately. Cynthia stammered frantically, reaching out to grab his arm. Do not touch me, Sean said firmly, pulling his body away from her grip. He picked up the stack of papers, looked over at me with a profound mixture of deep shame and sudden realization, and walked straight out of the banquet hall without ever looking back. Cynthia was left standing completely alone at the head of the room. The relatives who had been whispering moments earlier were now staring at her with unreserved disgust. She grabbed her designer purse, glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, and ran out the exit doors after my son. I slowly sat back down in my chair. My hands were shaking slightly, not from any lingering fear, but from the massive rush of adrenaline slowly draining out of my body. David leaned over gently and placed his warm hand over mine. Are you holding up okay, Nora? I do not feel happy. David, I admitted quietly, looking around at the empty dining seats. Exposing the truth was absolutely necessary for my dignity, but it still hurts terribly. Justice rarely feels like an easy victory in the immediate moment, David said softly. But you successfully protected your self-respect. The memorial dinner eventually continued, though the overall mood remained quiet and subdued. I did not gloat to anyone in attendance. I did not raise a toast to my victory over Cynthia. I simply thanked our guests for honoring my late husband's memory, paid the catering invoice in full, and drove myself home. 3 days after the disastrous dinner, Sean came over to my house completely alone. He looked utterly exhausted. Dark, heavy circles hung beneath his bloodshot eyes, and he carried a heavy cardboard box resting in his arms. He walked quietly into my kitchen and set the box down on the wooden table. Inside were the precious leather-bound history books that Cynthia had tried to throw away weeks ago. I found these hidden in the trunk of her car, Sean said very quietly. Thank you, Sean, I replied gently, turning on the stove to make us a warm pot of tea. He sat down at the table, staring silently at his own hands. We are officially getting a divorce. I hired a family lawyer yesterday morning. When I confronted her with the actual bank statements from the business, she didn't even try to deny it anymore. She just blamed me for not giving her enough attention over the years. He slowly looked up at me, heavy tears brimming in his eyes. Mom, I am so deeply sorry. I called you crazy. I let her push you around in your own home. I was so completely blind to what was happening. I did not offer a dramatic, emotional speech, nor did I pretend that everything was instantly fine between us again. True forgiveness requires time, and lost respect must be earned back through consistent actions. You were weak, Sean, I told him with absolute honesty. You actively chose quiet comfort over the uncomfortable truth, and it ultimately cost you dearly. But you are still my son, and I love you unconditionally. I will not leave you to fall apart, but I will also never allow you to use me as an emotional crutch again. Sean nodded solemnly, swallowing hard against his tears. I know, Mom. I really need to learn how to be a responsible adult on my own now. We sat together and drank our tea in quiet solace. It was certainly not a joyful family reunion, but it was an honest, healthy beginning. 6 full months have officially passed since that chaotic night at the country club banquet room. Cynthia moved completely out of state shortly after the divorce papers were finalized by the court. Sean rented a small, modest apartment located near his workplace. He now comes over to my house every single Sunday evening for dinner. We are actively rebuilding our parent-child relationship very slowly, brick by brick, ensuring it is grounded in mutual honesty rather than passive compliance. David and I still see each other regularly throughout the week. We enjoy taking long walks through the park, attending local theater plays, and appreciating the quiet comfort of genuine companionship, without ever feeling the desperate need to justify our private lives to anyone else. Looking back on everything that transpired, I candidly realize that I was not entirely blameless in how bad the family dynamic eventually became. I foolishly allowed Cynthia's subtle disrespect to slide for far too long, simply because I was terrified of pushing my son away. I kept my mouth shut when I should have firmly spoken up early on, allowing small slights to build up into a massive, explosive disaster. Through this painful experience, I learned that showing mercy without enforcing strict personal boundaries is ultimately just a form of self-sabotage. Being an older woman does not mean becoming invisible to the world, nor does it mean accepting subtle cruelty under the false guise of maintaining family harmony. Real justice is never about destroying your enemies or taking petty pleasure in their personal downfall. It is about standing firmly in your personal truth, protecting your inner peace, and forcing people to take full accountability for their own choices. I did not ruin my son's marriage. Cynthia managed to destroy it all by herself through her own selfish actions. All I did was stop helping her hide her mess. At 68 years old, I finally have my home, my family dignity, and my deep personal peace back. And that realization is worth far more than any public toast.
The irony of it all still hits me sometimes, even now. My name is Eunice Hadley, and 3 weeks ago I turned 68 years old. I had no party planned, no cake, just me, a pot of chamomile tea, and the old tabby cat my late husband brought home 12 years ago and named Captain for reasons he never fully explained. I had made peace with a quiet birthday. After the last few years, quiet felt like a gift in itself. So when a package showed up on my doorstep that morning, a small brown box, neatly taped with my son's handwriting on the label, I stood there longer than I should have, just staring at it. My son. We hadn't spoken in 14 months. I want to be fair when I tell this story. I've been working on that, being fair. My therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Osi, tells me that fairness to yourself is not the same as making excuses for people who hurt you. I'm still learning the difference. But I want you to understand that I didn't always see my son as someone capable of what I now know he's capable of. For most of his life, he was just my boy. Taller than his father by 2 inches, terrible at parallel parking, made the best scrambled eggs of anyone I've ever met. He called every Sunday until he met her. Then the calls became every other Sunday. Then once a month. Then nothing. His wife. I'll call her what she is. I'm not one of those mothers-in-law who hated her daughter-in-law from the start. I want that on the record. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I invited her to Thanksgiving 3 years running. I asked about her job, her family, her opinions on things. I bit my tongue so many times I'm surprised I have one left. But there was something about the way she looked at me, like I was a problem she hadn't figured out how to solve yet. The distance between my son and me grew so gradually I almost didn't notice it happening. One day, he just stopped returning calls. Texts went unanswered. When I drove to their house, once, just once, she answered the door and told me he wasn't home. He was. I could see his truck in the driveway. That was 14 months ago, the last time I tried. So you understand why I stood on the porch that morning with that box in my hands, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not hope exactly. More like the memory of hope. The ghost of it. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table. Captain jumped up and sniffed the corner of it. I made myself finish my tea before I opened it. I don't know why. Some part of me wanted to delay whatever this was, good or bad, for just a few more minutes. Inside was a tin of homemade cookies. Sugar cookies, it looked like, dusted with something, powdered sugar I assumed. There was a small card tucked underneath in my son's handwriting. Happy birthday, Mom. Thought you might like these. T. For Tobias. That's my son's name. Tobias Ray Hadley. I named him after my grandfather, who was one of the gentlest men I ever knew. Some days that fact alone breaks my heart. I set the card down and looked at the cookies. Here's the thing I've never been able to explain properly. Not even to Dr. the Reet. Not even to my sister when she asked me later. I don't know exactly what I felt in that moment. Part of me wanted to eat one right there, standing at the kitchen table in my bathrobe. Part of me wanted it so badly to be a real gesture, a real olive branch, that I almost let that wanting override everything else. But there was something. I can't point to a specific thing. The cookies looked fine. They smelled fine, buttery and sweet, the way sugar cookies should. But I'd spent 14 months being frozen out by my own son, and then on my birthday, out of nowhere, here were homemade cookies. No phone call, no explanation, just cookies, and a card signed with one letter. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a mother's worry. Dr. Malsing's tear. Osei would probably say I was experiencing hypervigilance, a trauma response. Maybe. But I put the lid back on the tin, and I left them on the counter. I told myself I'd eat one later after breakfast. Later never came. My neighbor Philomena, everyone calls her Phil, knocked on my door around noon that day. She'd seen the card in my mailbox and wanted to drop it off personally, which is exactly the kind of woman Phil is. 73 years old, still gardens in heels, makes a pound cake that could bring a grown man to tears. She has one of those faces that's just fundamentally kind. She came in as she always does and sat down at my kitchen table and started talking about her granddaughter's recital and the new family that moved in down the block, and I made more tea and listened, and it felt good. Normal, the way my birthday usually does not. When she was leaving, she noticed the tin. "Oh, are those homemade?" she said, already reaching for the lid. I don't know why I didn't stop her immediately. Maybe I was distracted. Maybe some part of me thought, if they're fine for Phil, they're fine. Maybe I'd already half convinced myself I was being paranoid. "My son sent them," I said. "How sweet," she said. "Can I try one for the road?" "Take a few," I said. "Take the whole tin." She laughed and said she'd just have 2 and leave the rest for me. I told her honestly that I was watching my sugar and she was doing me a favor. She tucked 3 cookies in a paper napkin and kissed my cheek and left. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. Then I threw the remaining cookies in the trash. I don't know what made me do it. I still can't explain it cleanly. Just a feeling that settled over me like cold water, slow and total. My son called the next morning at 8:47. I know because I was in the middle of watering the African violets on my windowsill, and I remember thinking, who calls at this hour? I almost didn't answer. "Hey," he said when I picked up. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone who has rehearsed. "Hello, Tobias." A pause. "Did you get the package?" "I did." "So," he said, "how were they? The cookies?" Something tightened in my chest. Not dramatically, not like in movies, just a small, quiet tightening, the way a door closes before you hear the lock click. "I didn't eat them," I said. Silence. "What?" "I gave them to my neighbor Phil," I said. "She came by yesterday afternoon. She loved them." The silence that followed was different from the first one, longer, and in it, I heard something I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe. It wasn't surprise. It was something that lived right next to surprise but was not the same thing. Something that sounded almost like recalculation. "You gave them away," he finally said. "She's a good neighbor," I said. My voice came out very steady. "I don't know how." "Mom." His voice changed. "Mom, listen to me. I need you to call her. Right now. I need you to call her and make sure she's..." He stopped. "Make sure she's what, Tobias?" Another silence. I think the recipe might have had something in it that, look, she might have a reaction. Some people are sensitive to certain ingredients, and What ingredients? I said. Just call her, please. Okay? Can you just call her right now and make sure she's okay? I hung up the phone. I called Phil. She answered on the second ring, sounding completely normal, and told me she was just heading out to water her rose bushes. I told her my son had mentioned something about a possible allergy ingredient in the cookies, and asked her how she was feeling. She said she felt perfectly fine, maybe a little more tired than usual, but that was just Tuesday, and laughed. I told her to call me if anything felt off. I sat down on my couch and did not move for a very long time. Phil called me back at 3 in the afternoon. Her voice was different. She said she'd been feeling strange for about an hour, dizzy, her stomach hurting. She thought it was just something she'd eaten, but her daughter happened to be over and was worried, and they were thinking about going to urgent care just to be safe. I told her to go, right now. I told her to tell the doctor she'd eaten homemade cookies and when she'd eaten them, and I told her I was coming. I drove to the urgent care on Route 9 with my hands very tight on the steering wheel, and my mind doing something I can only describe as a controlled panic. The kind where you don't fall apart because you don't have time to, so you just keep moving and save the falling apart for later. Phil was in a curtained bay when I arrived. Her daughter, a tall, no-nonsense woman named after her grandmother who I'd met maybe twice before, looked at me with an expression I won't forget. She's going to be okay, she told me first. They gave her something and she's stabilizing. I sat down in the plastic chair next to Phil's bed and held her hand, and she looked at me with those kind eyes and said, a little woozy, Eunice, honey, what was in those cookies? I told her I didn't know, but I was beginning to have a terrible feeling that I did. The doctor who treated Phil was a young man who took me aside after about an hour. He used careful language, clinical language, the kind that keeps everything at a distance while still communicating exactly what it needs to communicate. He said that Phil's symptoms were consistent with ingestion of a substance. He said they were running blood work. He said it would be helpful to know what exactly she had consumed. I told him about the cookies. I told him where they came from. I told him I thought he should call the police. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. I don't want to tell this part quickly, because it didn't happen quickly. It happened the way hard things usually do. Slowly, with a lot of waiting in between. The police came. I gave a statement. I told them about my son, about the 14 months of silence, about the birthday package. I told them about the phone call and the way his voice had sounded when he learned the cookies had gone to Phil instead of to me. I told them about the cookies I'd thrown in the trash. They asked me if I still had the tin, and I did, the tin I'd left on the counter. And they took it. I drove home that night in the dark and sat in my kitchen with Captain in my lap and didn't turn on the lights for a long time. I kept thinking about the phone call, about that silence, about the way he'd said, you gave them away. Not that's too bad. Not I wanted you to have them. Just, you gave them away. Like the problem wasn't that I hadn't eaten them. Like the problem wasn't that I hadn't eaten them. Like the problem was that someone else had. I thought about his wife. I thought about the way she'd looked at me through that doorway 14 months ago. I thought about all the years I tried to make something work that she had decided, from the beginning, would not work. I thought about my son, who I had loved more than I have words for, and I thought about how love alone is not enough to make someone choose you over their worst instincts. I did not sleep that night. The detectives came back 2 days later. There were 2 of them, a woman with close-cropped gray hair who did most of the talking, and a younger man who took notes. They sat at my kitchen table in the same chairs Phil had sat in just a few days before and told me what the lab had found. The cookies contained a substance. The tin had traces of it too. Phil had gotten a low enough dose because she'd only eaten 3 and because she was a healthy woman who'd noticed the symptoms quickly, that she was going to make a full recovery. The doctors expected a complete recovery. She was already home. The detective with the gray hair looked at me very carefully when she said the next part. There had been a small glass bottle found in my neighbor's recycling bin. Phil had noticed it and mentioned it to her daughter, who had mentioned it to the police because she hadn't recognized it as something of theirs. It had been tracked back, through some method they didn't fully explain to me, to a purchase. Online. Made 3 weeks before my birthday. My son's name was on the account. I nodded. I don't know what my face did. Mrs. Hadley, the detective said, I want to be very clear about what we're telling you. I understand, I said, and I did. I understood perfectly. I had understood. In some part of myself, I hadn't wanted to listen to since the moment I heard that silence on the phone. My son had sent me those cookies. He had made them or had them made, and he had put something in them, and he had mailed them to me for my birthday. And then he had called the next morning to ask how they were. At 8:47 in the morning, he had called to ask. I excused myself and went to the bathroom and turned on the tap so the detectives wouldn't hear me, and I put my hands on the sink and breathed for a while. Just breathed. The kind of breathing you do when you are trying to keep everything inside yourself from coming loose at once. Then I dried my hands and went back to the kitchen and answered the rest of their questions. My son was arrested 4 days after that. His wife was questioned, but as of the last thing I was told, no charges were filed against her. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't have enough information to say. What I know is what I know. I went to see Phil the morning after his arrest. She was sitting in her garden in a wide-brimmed hat, looking a little tired still but fundamentally herself, and she stood up when she saw me coming through the gate and she just hugged me. She didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did I. I'm so sorry, I finally said, into her shoulder. You saved me, she said. You threw those cookies away, and you called me, and you told me to go to the doctor. You saved me. I wanted to tell her I didn't feel like I'd saved anyone. I wanted to tell her I felt like the person responsible for putting her in that urgent care bay in the first place, by raising someone who could do something like this, by being the reason he thought he had something to gain. I didn't say any of that. I just held on. There was a version of this story where I never doubted the cookies, where I ate one at the kitchen table on my birthday morning and poured myself a second cup of tea and thought, maybe things are getting better, where by that afternoon I was sick, and Phil was fine, and the bottle was found in my recycling bin, not hers, and the detective sat at my kitchen table asking my neighbor, not me, what she remembered about the day she stopped by. That version is the one I think about most. I don't know why I hesitated. I can't give you a clean reason. I've talked to Dr. Osei about it, and she says that sometimes our nervous systems know things our conscious minds haven't caught up to yet. Maybe. Or maybe I was just tired that morning, tired in a bone-deep way I'd been carrying for 14 months, and I didn't have the energy to let myself be happy about a tin of cookies from a son who hadn't spoken to me in over a year. Maybe my exhaustion saved my life. I don't know what to do with that. What I know is this. I am 68 years old. I live alone with a cat named Captain. My neighbor Phil brought me a pound cake last Saturday that was, I am not exaggerating, the best thing I have eaten in years. My sister flew in from Raleigh and stayed for a week, and we watched old movies, and I cried more than I'd cried in years and felt better afterward than I had in longer than I could remember. My son has an attorney. There will be a trial, or there won't. I don't know yet. I am not thinking about that right now. I am thinking about what's in front of me. The African violets on my windowsill. The chamomile tea. Captain's warm weight on my feet when I sit on the couch in the evenings. I loved my son. I want to be honest about that. I don't use the past tense lightly, but I have also learned at 68 that love is not the same as loyalty to someone who would harm you. That you can grieve a person who is still alive. That the son I raised and the man who mailed those cookies are not the same person, and somewhere between those two people something happened that I will never fully understand, and that is a loss I will carry. But I am here. I am still here. And that, on some days, is enough. I've thought a lot about what it means when the people we love most become the people we can least afford to trust, not in an abstract way. In the specific, ordinary, kitchen table way, the way you stand holding a tin of cookies and feel something shift inside you that you can't quite name, and you listen to that feeling even when every other part of you wants not to. That instinct saved my life. I don't say that dramatically. I say it plainly, the way the detective said it to me. The way Phil said it in her garden with her arms around me. What I did, setting those cookies aside, throwing them away, calling Phil the moment something felt wrong. None of it felt like bravery in the moment. It felt like exhaustion. It felt like a woman who had simply run out of the energy required to pretend everything was fine. And I think that's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. Sometimes the wisdom isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it's just a tiredness that finally stops performing hope on behalf of people who stopped deserving it. Tobias made choices. A chain of them, each one building on the last, each one requiring him to choose the worst version of himself over the better one. I don't know exactly when that started. I've stopped trying to locate the precise moment. What I know is that choices compound. The small ones, the quiet ones, the ones made in private. They don't stay private, they show up eventually. They showed up in a tin of cookies on my doorstep on a Tuesday morning in October. And here's what I've learned about cause and consequence. It doesn't require anything mystical. It doesn't need a grand reckoning or a cosmic ledger. It just requires time. Tobias called the next morning because he expected a result. He got a different one. What unraveled after that was simply the natural weight of what he'd already set in motion. Nothing more, nothing less. I think about Phil a lot. About the fact that she ate 3 cookies and not 10. About the fact that she mentioned the bottle to her daughter. About the fact that her daughter is a no-nonsense woman who called the police without hesitating. A whole chain of ordinary human decency, each link holding. That's the other side of the equation. Not just that bad choices have consequences, but that good ones do too. Phil's kindness in coming to my door that day. Her daughter's clear-headedness. The detective who listened without dismissing me. Every one of those people doing the decent thing in their small moment. That's what I want to carry forward. Not bitterness. I've earned the right to bitterness and I'm choosing to set it down. What I want to carry is the knowledge that the small, quiet choices matter. The decision to listen to yourself. The decision to call a neighbor and say, "I'm worried. Please go get checked." The decision to sit in a plastic chair at urgent care and hold someone's hand until the news is good. I am 68 years old and I live alone, and some days are harder than others. But I am here. I made it through something that was designed to make sure I didn't. And I am still sitting at my kitchen table in the morning with my tea going cold while Captain complains about his breakfast. And I am still watching the African violets on the windowsill. And I am still, against all odds and by the grace of my own gut instinct, completely, stubbornly, gratefully alive.